So I'm just going to do a quick video this evening on a book I've recently read. Very, very short book, but I came across it on Kindle and just thought I'd have to pick this one up. So the book that I'm going to be reviewing this evening is called The Path of the Martyrs, Charles Martel, Battle of Tours and the Birth of Europe. And this one picked up for, I think it was just 99 pence on Kindle. It was one of the deals there about 1 or 2 months ago. It's written by Ed West, good historian, and roughly it's a really short book, but it's only 110 pages, so this one really is like an introductory book on the topic, which I will gladly be following up. It's a topic which I don't know too much about, which is post-Roman collapse, post-Roman Empire collapse, and it's effectively a clash of civilizations prior to the Crusades, really. So you've got, just to give an introduction for this then, so what you've got is the climactic battle of the Battle of Tours, or Battle of Poitiers, as it is also known as, in 732 between the leader of the Franks, which would then become the French royal family and German royal families. So the Franks were a Germanic tribe that would be settling in what we now know as France, and they would be fighting against the incursions of the Umayyad Caliphate. So the Umayyad Caliphate were the second inheritors of the Empire of Islam after the death of Muhammad. So they were effectively invading what we would say in Roman history as Gaul or southern France. Up until that point, they'd already conquered the majority of Hispania, or the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, bar a couple of little enclaves at the top in the Basque area and northern Spain. And they'd invaded southern France. So this battle led to the climactic clash of 732. So what I'll do is I'll go through some points which I really enjoyed and how the book is set up. So in fairness to Ed West, he does give quite a good, concise explanation about the book, about how the events which led up to the battle. Dedicates a whole chapter on the development and the rise of Islam from out of the deserts of Arabia, from Muhammad's conquering of the various tribes to take the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and Arabia, and then just the what seemed an unstoppable destiny towards conquering the known world, really, from the 600s all the way through then to 732. So describing the push northwards out of Arabia, taking what was then the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire's territories in modern-day Palestine, and then also in Egypt as well. The Sassanid Empire, which is effectively modern-day Iran, modern-day Iraq, all those lands there, but really with a focus on the conquering of North Africa, and then stepping across the Straits of Gibraltar, then over into Spain, or as it was known then afterwards as Al-Andalus, Andalusia. So one brilliant chapter on that. I'm looking for a couple of more books actually, just to see if I can, segment the sort of the march of early Islam and the Rashidun Caliphate, caliphs I should say, who were the first inheritors of the legacy of Muhammad. So I'll be looking to see if I can pick up a few books of that in the next couple of months. But that was a brilliant chapter, in fairness. The first two chapters were the march of Islam out of the deserts of Arabia. The second one then, which was a lot more meatier and I think really needed needed a little bit more fleshing out, particularly for somebody who was an au fait with the time period in the Dark Ages, which was the early centuries Roman Empire, from Jesus' birth all the way through to the collapse of the Roman Empire, and then subsequently the Germanic tribes' incursions into Western Europe, settlements of those tribes, explaining the splits between the Visigoths in Spain, the Lombards in northern Italy and through the Italian peninsula, the Franks then who settled into Western Francia, which would be then France, Central Francia, which you're talking about the sort of Low Countries of Belgium, Holland, Eastern France, like Alsace and Lorraine, Western Germany, and then you've got then, which was referred to then as Austrasia, or Eastern Francia, which we know is effectively Germany these days. So that was quite interesting, just detailing sort of the collapse of the empire, not just as the loss of a sort of hegemonic policeman in the world as the Roman Empire was at its zenith and a stabilizing factor, but also then the tussles over religion and the control over the Western Hemisphere of Europe as well was quite interesting. The to and froing of different tribes, and what happened up until the point where we get to 732 and the Battle of Tours is then the introduction to the Franks, the early Merovingian kings of Western Francia. You may know the name the Merovingian kings. It was popularised recently, over the last few years, with the Dan Brown Da Vinci Code books. Dan Brown hypothesised is a fictional book that Jesus' descendants were the Merovingian kings of France, but that's obviously a fictional book, and as Ed West describes, I mean, the Merovingians were quite albeit not a technologically advanced or sophisticated tribe or civilization by any means, but they were quite decadent. The sort of general sort of monogamous and strict adherence to Catholic or Christian teachings as we now know, and obviously centuries gone, and really taken root just yet with the settlers in Western Europe. I mean, effectively, what was described in the book is that you had a bit of a two-tier society really in France at the time. So you had, in southern France, you had a totally separate civilization effectively from the Frankish Germanic tribe, which had settled in the north and Normandy and in eastern France, whereas in, say, Aquitaine in the southwest and in the general southern area bordering what is now Spain would be people who would be classed as sort of Gallo-Roman, those people who held to older Roman traditions, Roman ways of governing, Roman ways of farming, albeit not directly from the hinterland of Rome itself, but more from a sort of outpost colonial people. But two-tier society. I mean, different culture, definitely, different languages as well. So really, there was very little sort of integration really, and thought of a France as a sort of unified nation state wasn't on the table at the time. So that's what I found quite interesting was in those chapters is really explaining about the different tribes and their influence on Western Europe as well, and how they interacted and really faced the threat of incursions and the what looked like really an unstoppable new religious force with unbelievably battle-hardened warriors who had swept pretty much everybody before them up until that point as well. So that was quite interesting. We get then on to the part of the book where the main the main players are being introduced. So for the Muslims, it's Abdal Rahman, one of the main commanders of who will command the troops at Tor. Not an awful lot said about this particular commander, apart from just putting down rebellions and making sure that the Visigoths or the Spanish indigenous people of Iberia were placid and were really kept in check, but does go into a bit of depth about how even after the Battle of Tor, which in itself was a decisive battle for Western Europe, was that there were more incursions along trade routes. Even up until say the 900s and 800s, certainly places like Narbonne, Avignon were effectively in Muslim-controlled hands for a good 100 years after, or 75 years after. So effectively, although the battle itself is decisive, there was a lot of fluidity, and there was room for commanders like Abdal Rahman to come in and make sure that they can push the boundaries a little bit more further north and try and sweep before them. But really, what came across in the book as well in the chapter about the commander was very little sort of thought and consideration for the Franks as a military force themselves. I'll come on to them in a second, but I think that was a contributing factor in the downfall of the Umayyad army that lost the Tour. Was and you do see this an awful lot, in history and also in other parts of life. Whether it could be a fantastic team or a specific sports person or somebody who's generally on a roll. They've not lost or they've not really had a challenge in a while, and things are going well. They sort of patching up over any deficiencies because they're still achieving success and getting results, and then bang, something happens which totally just stops you in your tracks and makes you reevaluate everything you've been doing, which is what this Battle of Tor really was. And what we get on to then the next chapter was in regards to Charles Martel, who would be the leader of the Franks. So Charles Martel was effectively put into a bit of a Game of Thrones a Game of Thrones analogy. He was the power behind the throne. He wasn't himself initially the king of the Franks or anything like that. He was effectively a kingmaker, somebody who would happily put one of the Merovingians and counsel one of the Merovingian kings before him, but effectively knowing that he was the lever puller, the puppet master, and he inherited the role from his own father, who played an identical role with the Merovingian elite as well. What I found quite interesting about him as well was that his quite staggering success as a general, in military intelligence, knowing that even when they come up against an army like the Umayyads, who maybe they've had word of mouth or not really faced in combat at all, if it often at all, how he was able to adapt his tactics to effectively rule the ground at Tor and win the day. But it wasn't just the Muslims that he had a problem with. I mean, the guy made war on everybody and anybody, was often at war or on campaign pretty much every year leading up to the Battle of Tor and then afterwards. So the majority of his foes would be people like the Saxons in Germany, and then the Saxons themselves in England as well, who would settle there. the Goths in Spain, and the Goths, what you would say in the Tyrol or Austria or northern Italy as well. The Lombards, who would really be chafing up against the Franks as well. They would be, having incursions into the Italian peninsula, the Lombards, as well as Aquitaine. So the Duchy of Aquitaine, effectively, like I say, was these are the Gallo-Roman people then who tried to sort of maintain that sort of residual Roman Empire in the West, despite the fact that it crumbled a good few centuries before as well. So, but the precursor to the Battle of Tours was the Duchy of Aquitaine's leader, which was Otto. There'd been a sort of a bit of a dance between Otto and Charles Martel over whether really to commit to an alliance or to sort of, are they going to go to war or not? And Otto had gone to war against the Umayyad Caliphate and Abdal Rahman, and was soundly beaten prior to Tours. So effectively, what had happened up until Tours then was you've had Charles Martel on campaign. I think the book said that he was in Eastern Europe at the time, so you're looking at the sort of the Eastern Francia. I mean, Francia, as it was considered a whole up until that point. So you've got Francia, Eastern Francia, pushing into Central Europe, down into Hungary, and on the Danube, particularly campaigning on the Danube against other tribes. And at this point, he is, effectively sort of alerted that there's an invasion force of around. This is where there's a bit of a debate, where you've got some sources saying as much as 80,000 soldiers in the Muslim army. I know Wikipedia is not a it's not really any sort of benchmark to look at, but a lot of the sources say around anywhere between 50 and 80,000 soldiers for the invasion force of the Umayyad Caliphs. And Charles Martel marched his army back, battle-hardened warriors, no heavy cavalry, marched them to an area where they dominated a favourable piece of ground, which was near Tours and Poitiers. Took up a position on a high slope, you could say. But the numbers of his force were camouflaged by the fact that they had a forest of trees in front of them, which would then really prevent the heavy cavalry of the Muslims to then try and mow them down. I mean, albeit Abdal Rahman, the leader of the invasion force, did try to use the heavy cavalry, but this is what really did mess up the battle itself. Now, he needed to get to Tours and sack the city in order to make sure that his soldiers had the booty that was promised them, all the treasures that they could come across, as well as use the city to replenish the army before there would be either settlement there or further incursions into Western Francia again. But what stood in between Tours and replenishing his army was the army of Charles Martel, that they think would have been around between 15 and 25,000 troops, which it depends on which way you're looking at it. There are some sources saying that the two sides were slightly evenly matched, maybe just in favour of the Muslims. Others wildly saying that the Muslim army had 80,000 soldiers. I think the truth might be a little bit in between. You're talking somewhere around 40,000 against 25,000 maybe. And I think what really won the day, as I described, is favourable position, a favourable battlefield, favourable tactics as well that has been employed. despite the fact of not having any heavy cavalry, and that the Muslims didn't really give a second's thought, it seems, in their writings, of considering the Franks as having any sort of reputation as a good fighting force or a reputable opponent prior to tours speaks volumes, really. And they are not considering them to be a challenge, that the Franks were set up in a bit of a square formation with infantry in what we would consider to be like a phalanx, like a 300 warrior phalanx sort of style, as in Alexander's phalanxes as well, Macedonian style, and they would absolutely just withstand every heavy cavalry charge uphill through dense forest as well. So, I mean, effectively, you're looking at the loss of numbers of the battlefield. Again, Wikipedia is not the best sort of source for it, but they are saying you are looking at 10,000 plus casualties for the Muslims on their side, whereas there would be only 1,000 to 2,500 for the Frankish army. So overall, the battle itself was just really halted the empire, the Umayyad Caliphate in its tracks, really. There was no there were some attempts at reinvasion afterwards in 735 to 739. There's a war there, but never really threatened France, or really threatened Italy. Again, did the Caliphate, and in fact, essentially what happened after the Battle of Tours and the conciliation of the Frankish Empire under Charles Martel, and then subsequently after Charles Martel, he had helped then displace his family helped displace those Merovingian kings, and then you have what's known as the Carolingians coming through, which is his family, and famously his grandson was Charlemagne. Charlemagne, they still give some in the European Union. They still give some Charlemagne awards out today for people, who do all these types of works to unite Europe and all this type of jazz. I mean, Charlemagne was effectively the original Dark Ages United of Europe, lording over what is now France, parts of Spain, northern Spain. You're looking at the Low Countries, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, Western Germany, parts of Denmark, northern Italy as well, Austria. All these areas would come under the banner of the Frankish Empire and under Charlemagne. However, after his death, the empire was carved up into three by his family, and you have Eastern Francia, which effectively becomes Germany, Central Francia, which is basically split in the middle, which is northern Italy, Burgundy, which is Western France, Alsace, and then the Low Countries above, and then Western Francia, which then is what we now know as the nation-state of France today. But overall, I mean, you can see, and it explains the legacy of the battle, which is then the turning of the tide, which would then, a couple of centuries later, it would lead into what we have then, which is the Crusades. And I've read a book on the Crusades recently, so I'll probably be doing a video on that after this as well. But I thought this book by Ed West was pretty good, and albeit a short book, 110 pages, I really enjoyed reading it. It was probably like an introductory book to the topic. I will be following this up with looking to see if I can get a book in greater detail, really, about the time period, and really just sort of try to get rid of those blind spots of knowledge and understanding on this time period. But the legacy of this battle is that it stopped the Muslim incursions into Western Europe, albeit after Spain had fallen. And then what happened then subsequently, centuries after, was the rolling up then of and the use of a sort of a reconquering and reconquista, particularly in Spain, of those taken areas in Spain. But effectively, from the Muslim point of view as well, is that this was really a sort of just a bit of although it did stop momentum from the early years of conquests out of Arabia into North Africa, all the way through the Middle East, and then into India, what will be now Pakistan, Iran, into the Caucasus regions as well. This was effectively stopped in the West, and albeit it was, the Franks were themselves of no threat immediately to the gains of the Umayyad Caliphate. I think what you're looking at this point, up until the point of the Crusades, would be the sort of the zenith of the of Islam up until the Crusades. You are looking at people who, albeit were not the direct inheritors of Roman culture, Roman understanding, Roman technology, Greek understanding, Greek philosophy, but they were major contributors into reintroducing lost ideas, lost technology, lost philosophy and learning into the West as well. And a lot has got to be said for Charles Martel and for Charlemagne as well, which is to by using Christianity and the churches and the network that they possessed as well, and people who were there, ordinary religious men who would then copy information and distribute information, thereby raising literacy levels. I mean, effectively, we're looking at a bit of a 180 from where some people think we are today, which is that we were the barbarians in Western Europe, and the barbarians were the ones that stopped the oncoming civilization to at Tor. And I know that Charles Martel in particular is held up as some sort of, particularly by those idiots who sort of pronounce racist beliefs that he's a sort of an Aryan saviour, but the guy was a product of his time. I don't think he was, again, like I say on most videos, you can't judge people by modern morals and modern standards. You just got to take people as they are at the time, and try to understand their motives as they were the history makers at the time as well. So, and looking back as a review on this book, which I think was superb, was that Charles Martel didn't want to be, and his family and his influence didn't, it would have waned if they were to become yet another province of the Umayyad Caliphate. As simple as that. I mean, and to be taken over by what they saw as people who were militarily sophisticated and culturally sophisticated. I just didn't. You look at it on the whole, and they, like I say, they didn't fancy being an outlying province of that empire, and they put a stop to that 732 at Tor. So, just to wrap up then, I give this book a rating of 3.5 stars out of 5. Really enjoyed it, and it leads into the next book, which I'll do, which is the Battle of Hattin in 1187, which was part of the Crusades. So, I'll have a look at that now. But just to wrap up, so if you are interested in buying this book, I did get it on Kindle. It took hardly any time to read at all. It is only 110 pages, like I say. You can pick it up at the moment for $1.99 on Kindle, unless you've got Kindle Unlimited. So if you've got, I think it's Amazon Prime or Kindle Unlimited, one of these type of packages, you can read it for free. It's part of the package. If you want to buy a physical copy, it says the paperback is only $3.99, which is quite reasonable. But if you're going to get it on Kindle, $1.99 is hardly anything, and I'd say definitely get that, because this is a brilliant book just to introduce you to the time period, and quite a climactic and decisive battle for the fate of Western Europe. So yeah, brilliant, good book, 3.5 stars out of 5, and